Alexander Heffner is the host of the Open Mind program on PBS in the US. He's also an analyst on American politics. He tonight spoke on how divisiveness has become a pervasive plague on both public discussion and governance at Macquarie University. And he joins us live now from Sydney. Alexander, great to talk to you tonight. We don't... Alex, great to have you. Look, I can't go past asking you, just as we've read that story about Charlie Rose, who would be a colleague of yours at PBS. Was it a shock to learn this?
Well, I think in this country we're experiencing a crisis of incivility. It's what I spoke about tonight and what we're discussing in the post-truth era. But we spoke at length, and the audience was quite engaged in a discussion on three pillars of incivility that seem to govern the American political process, and I would add media, and that is bigotry, obstructionism, and dysfunction. But in the wake of President Trump's election, I think you're seeing a pushback against this idea that a tribal masculinity has overtaken the U.S. And so women are rightly empowered in insisting that the media, Hollywood, and politics speak and move forward constructively and embrace a new citizenship.
You say that, but at the same time you've got Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore doggedly refusing to leave the race despite multiple accusations of sexual assault in this case. How do you explain the fact that there is not the GOP doesn't have greater power to pull someone like this out of the race?
Well, at this point in the election cycle, it's too late. But Doug Jones is the first competitive Democrat in Alabama since the tide turned for the two-party system. So the fact that he's leading in polls that have been released to date indicates that there is a swing. In 2004, you might remember that there was the moral values voter. And I think that we are reactivating, re-energizing, galvanizing anew a keener sense of morality, and that's going to be the Republican Party ultimately and the Democratic Party, who have to find leaders who don't carry the kind of questionable baggage that you saw in 2016.
Talking of civility, it was interesting to read that H.R. McMaster is the latest of Donald Trump's top men to call him an idiot and dumb, apparently, in conversations. I mean, is this just part of a robust Washington that we haven't really seen displayed externally before, or do you think it is this example of incivility?
Well, I think that the focus of journalists has to be constructive. And of course we need to have accountability, watchdog journalism to protect and safeguard our liberties as Americans and as citizens broadly. But I think that anonymous sourcing is so decisive in stories that reveal injury to people's livelihoods. And so when you take anonymous sources and blow them into these he said, she said, or in this case, he said, I think that it's ultimately counterproductive. But there's certainly, Bev, questions about the intellectual bandwidth of this presidency, and the generals around him are challenging the president's capacity to learn and mature on the job.
Should that give us comfort?
Well, I think it should give us comfort that there is some firewall. What I was expressing to your countrymen and woman tonight was that the federalism system in the U.S., if you look at the recent populist outcry across the globe, the U.S. has a federalist system so that municipalities, cities, states have an opportunity. So it's not just about those who are preserving sanity in the executive branch. It's the fact that governance in the U.S. extends beyond the executive branch and federal powers.
Alexander, I'm interested to get your views on what you think has led to this divisiveness in politics in the U.S. and around the world.
Well, we saw when the social media councils testified before Congress just a delinquence, an absence of responsibility when it comes to ownership of the culprit. And we saw the weaponization, the monetization of fraud in what I call anti-social media. not pro-social or even social media. And so it's the toxic fusion of a cable news culture that has further entrenched ideologies, and that combined today with this high velocity, rapidly moving digital media culture that doesn't allow for bridge building and consensus building and ultimately compromise. So I think we need to do soul searching, and I believe that the candidates that won in 2017 and the ones that will win in 18 and maybe even in the presidential election in 2020 will revive that pro-social energy towards a more constructive politics. I think it's within reach.
Is there not, though, a greater disconnect? I take your point about the media being able to sort of impregnate people's views and disillusionment, but is there a greater divide that we're not paying attention to because the world has become captivated by money and glamour and 15 minutes of fame?
Well, certainly the celebrification of public affairs was evident during the 2016 campaign, and I think that reporters who did not view their responsibility as speaking truth to power. I was here at Macquarie University, but earlier participated in a session at the University of Sydney's Post-Truth Initiative. So I think it's fundamentally important, whether it's here in Australia or in the US, to look at the causal relationship between folks' resentments and what the source is. And if we identify the sources of those resentments that have led to the entrenchment of partisan politics and the viciousness and the vitriol and the venom that so dominate our experience, then I think we can learn from each other again. And that's really the critical point. You allude to divisiveness. Well, there's an opportunity to overcome that through language and through, frankly, more scrutiny placed on social media in importing a civic fabric that is not in digital communications today. So that's a fundamental point that I emphasize.
So to your point, how do you contain that social media? How do you contain that message when it is so easily manipulated?
Well, I think you saw the exploitation of these media. Let's remember that Mark Zuckerberg and company refused to even acknowledge the presence of malicious content or the influence they had on the election. And now it seems to the influence they had on Brexit and other elections beyond the US. So how do you grapple with this challenge? I think that you require more transparency, in fact, utter complete transparency with ad buyers. When those executives testified before Capitol Hill, they refused to even say, they could not acknowledge how many bots bought ads versus how many human beings in the Trump or Clinton campaigns or their political action committees bought ads. And the fact that they don't have that information explains the present reality. The distrust, the mistrust, the disinformation, the misinformation. So you need to ensure that political ads are advertised as such on social media, and you have to combat the proliferation of bots and trolls which have animated the Twitter sphere. And finally, it appears that in recent days, this is so fast moving, but in recent days and weeks, these executives are becoming more aware that their media, that their platforms have weaponized bigotry, and I would say have played into this vicious cycle of incivility.
Really great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
You too. Thank you, Bev.